I think nobody will believe just how stupid this is if I don't directly quote the text. So let's begin by directly quoting John Stuart Mill. Quote, "If I am asked what I mean by a difference of quality in pleasures, or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another, merely as a pleasure, except its being greater in amount, there is but one possible answer. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or most who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure." Let's pause to reflect on how absurd, how abhorrent it would be to rule a society along the lines of this philosophy if we were to believe that society should be reshaped to serve the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. And this is our definition of happiness. So should the government encourage people to eat cheese or not? Should they eat cheese or should they quit eating cheese and eat a vegan diet? Well, apparently the greatest happiness, the greatest number of people is shown because people love eating cheese. The vast majority of people who have tried both lifestyles prefer eating cheese. The fact that it's unhealthy doesn't matter. Greatest happiness of the greatest number of people through a simple appeal to popularity fallacy. That's all there is to it. So, should people eat donuts, deep-fried dessert products like donuts, or should they eat a meager diet of boiled vegetables as recommended by the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine? Crude appeal to popularity. Should the government encourage people to gamble or should they discourage gambling? Should gambling perhaps be made illegal? Would we have a happier society? This is all about happiness. Would we have a happier society with no gambling in it, as opposed to, say, every major city in the United States encouraging gambling the way that Las Vegas, Nevada does? Guess what, guys? The polling data is in. The vast majority of people enjoy gambling a lot more than they enjoy the study of political philosophy. I want to say very briefly, if you listen to people who are former members of cults reflecting on their lives, they very often say that when they first joined the cult, when they first joined a charismatic religious group, whatever it was, they had misgivings. They could tell that some of the things they were reading, some of the philosophical principles they were hearing really didn't make sense, but they pushed that doubt aside and they told themselves they have to believe in this, they have to make it make sense, they have to rationalize this to themselves. And then later they look back and they say, I wish I'd paid more attention to my own misgivings. All right? For me, even as a child, the fundamental absurdity of utilitarianism, the idea of ruling greatest happiness to the greatest number of people, the idea of defining happiness through this pleasure-pain calculus, appeal to popularity. Whatever is the most popular enjoyment is the objectively real enjoyment. Okay? The problems with this, the profound incoherence in this, was obvious to me even as a child. Now, I'm heterosexual, okay? And within heterosexual males, my taste in women is not that uncommon, okay? There are some heterosexual men who prefer really fat women, not me, okay? How does this make sense to them? You read this, say, oh, well, some guys like slender, fit women, and some guys like fat women. Oh, yeah, well, but objectively, it's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous to pretend there's something objectively real. How do you think gay people feel reading this? Okay? Homosexual people read this, and they say, oh, well, if objectively the majority of people, the great majority of people who have experience of both pleasures would choose one of the great majority of people are heterosexual. That's completely meaningless to you if you personally are gay, right? If for you personally, one kind of sex would be misery and another would be pleasure. That's all there is to it. There's no way we can find a foothold to make pleasure objectively real outside of the merely subjective reality of desire. What does water taste like? When you're thirsty, and especially if you're suffering from thirst outdoors in the heat and you're uncertain of where or how you're going to find drinking water. If you've ever been in those circumstances, the way that water tastes when you're desperate for a sip of water is unbelievably delicious. And if you're already full and satiated and relaxing and sitting in an air-conditioned room and you're not particularly thirsty, then the taste of water seems like nothing at all. The difference between a beautiful woman and an ugly woman is in the eye of the beholder. It's subjective. It's relative to me and my desire. Whether you find women attractive or men attractive is subjective. It's relative to the perceiver. It's relative to human desire. And that is all there is to it. What we desire subjectively seems to us like the most real thing in the world. But of course, it's the least real. Whether eating a donut is delicious or disgusting depends on you and your cognition and your desire. Whether eating French fries from McDonald's, deep fried, saturated with oil French fries, is delicious or disgusting is relative to you. And guess what the good news is? The way you experience the world, what seems to be pleasant and unpleasant, it can change with knowledge. Knowing changes feeling, feeling changes desiring. I find French fries disgusting. And it's partly because I know what they are, I know what they're made of. I feel revolted eating French fries. I eat a very spare vegan diet, eat a lot of broccoli, eat a lot of peas, lately frozen peas, okay? However, I do not share this utilitarian delusion that what I find pleasant is objectively real. And I know that if I were stupid enough to subscribe to this appeal to popularity fallacy, I'm only further marginalizing myself, because then I'd be recognizing what the majority of people consider to be pleasure to be the objectively real pleasure, and all the things I'm committed to, whether it's caring about philosophy or humanitarian work or caring about animal rights, then all of those things become unreal. They become subordinated relative to this ridiculous hierarchy of the pleasure-pain calculus. However, John Stuart Mill himself was, of course, a snob. John Stuart Mill had a lot more in common with me than he had in common with the average man who enjoys gambling and smoking cigars and eating deep-fried donuts. John Stuart Mill, like myself, was somebody who would enjoy reading Aristotle and Plato. So, of course, he cannot let his philosophy stand on this one leg alone. The most famous part of it, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. No. Immediately after this quotation, he then presses on to say that, of course, he believes in a distinction between higher and lower pleasures. And for this argument, there is absolutely no basis whatsoever except bias, prejudice, cultural familiarity, ultimately a religious mentality. This is simply the founding of a new religion. It is appealing to your sense of faith and belief. Now, if you don't think this is culturally relative, what is a higher pleasure and what is a lower pleasure? Imagine how different this would sound to someone who grew up Muslim in a Muslim majority culture. In that culture, they have a very clear sense of what are the higher pleasures, what are the refined pleasures, what are the pleasures a refined gentleman would enjoy and indulge in, and what are the lower and despicable pleasures. Think about a stereotypical Parisian Frenchman, someone from Paris, France, who grew up in that culture with a sort of mixture of Christian and atheist background, what they think are the refined pleasures, all right? Both of those groups, I utterly revile the things they consider most pleasant. Okay, people who grow up in Paris, France, they think that drinking red wine and eating steak tartare and trying to seduce the woman who they're employing as an au pair to take care of their daughter is the highest pleasure. Okay, let's be real. Sorry, I've spent a lot of time in France. Alcohol, meat, and cheating on your wife with younger women, these are like the dominant refined pleasures of French society. And you know what, even the stuff that's on French public television and radio, the sitting around and reading of what they consider literature, what they consider high literature in France, I despise all of that stuff also. Okay, that's me subjectively. Okay, but there is no way anyone can sit and come to this ridiculous utilitarian judgment that, in French culture, their idea of what are the high pleasures, the refined pleasures, those are correct. Whereas in a Muslim society, their idea of the high pleasures, the higher, more refined enjoyments, that's incorrect. There's no way you can come to the judgment that what Japanese people or Tibetan people think is high or think is low in the sense of high and low is correct or incorrect. There is absolutely no objective reality to this discourse whatsoever. Whereas the first premise, the first leg, at least you could measure that. You could go out and ask people, you can poll people, you can just, measure the economic reality of it. What percentage of people enjoy gambling? What percentage of people think gambling is a better use of their time and money than reading philosophy or reading about politics even? Okay, we know gambling is really popular. There's something in human nature that enjoys gambling. All right, but I, for my part, if my own son were spending 20% of his money every year gambling, if I had a son who grew up and he went to Las Vegas, Nevada every 3 months or 6 months or something, there are a lot of people like that who have a regular vacation schedule going to Las Vegas, Nevada, I would say to him, look, this is bad and depraved and wrong. And I'm aware that the gamblers, the people who enjoy gamblers, they outnumber me. They may be the vast majority or they may be the plurality. Gambling is popular. People who truly believe and experience gambling as pleasant, they outnumber the people like me 10 to 1 or 100 to 1. And I'm in the position of saying against the utilitarians, no, that doesn't mean that they're right and I'm wrong. I can't accept this. This is ridiculous. And again, if you're a homosexual, there's no way you can say, like just from a sincere subjective perspective, there's no way you can say that heterosexuality is right and homosexuality is wrong. These things are radically subjective. They're reciprocal with desire in the same sense that a shadow is reciprocal with its source of light. You turn off the light bulb, you lose the shadow. Full stop, period. One is not more real than the other in comparing one shadow to the other. It's not convenient for me to look at gambling this way and recognize, hey, you know what? It's a really difficult aesthetic, ethical, and political argument for me to argue that gambling should be illegal when you live in a culture where gambling is celebrated as normal. All right, and then, of course, from the other side, look at an Islamic majority culture. In an Islamic majority culture, they really look down on gambling as being a very low pleasure, as being very despicable, something a refined and educated gentleman would not do. So this is all that utilitarianism comes down to, is authoritarianism. It's just John Stuart Mill saying that from his perspective, some pleasures are truly human, are truly suitable for refined, sophisticated humanity. And he's going to decide what those are. And then he's going to force everyone through education or coercion or legislation to agree with his hierarchy of the pleasures. And that is absolutely no better than Catholicism or Islam or an authoritarian form of Buddhism like Tibetan Buddhism. There's someone in charge who's a religious leader or a shaman who decides what is pleasant and unpleasant, and they've written up the so-called calculus, and they now rule society in the pursuit of the so-called greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. But it's not. It's not the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. It is one ideological religious leader's idea of the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. They believe, on a religious level, they believe it is in your best interest for you to study the philosophy of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the great names from ancient Greece, right? How does that sound to a Japanese person? You think that's an objectively real pleasure-pain calculus for what's... You think that's an objectively real measure of utility? You think there's social utility in forcing children to study the philosophy of ancient Athens? You don't think that sounds a little bit strange to someone who's born and raised in Beijing, China, born and raised in Tokyo, Japan, born and raised in India? How about the people who were conquered by European imperialism? How about someone who is ethnically Mohawk or Ojibwe or Cree or Dene or Navajo? Okay, so you conquered them, you destroyed their site, and then you're saying, hey, guess what, guys? It's objectively real that your culture and your religion and your philosophical heritage is worthless, and here's the utility for your happiness. In order to make you more happy as an individual, in order to make society more happy in aggregate, for everyone's greatest happiness, we're going to force you to read Socrates, Plato, Xenophon, Aristotle, right? That's the true philosophy. Okay? That's not, oh yeah, right, that's not a culturally relative concept. That's not just our bias or our prejudice because that's who we happen to be. How do you think a Muslim leader would regard these philosophies? Don't you think a Muslim king or monarch would have a different idea of what philosophy would be in society's interest to force everyone to study? They did it for centuries. The Catholics did it for centuries. All these different authoritarian societies, including China. I mean, with China, it was a relatively small elite who were forced to read the tomes of philosophy that defined that society, but it was a tremendously influential elite. Anyone who wanted a position in government, even a very lowly position like a clerk or a scribe, and all of the bureaucrats in China, they all had to read the same stack of books. There's this long list of philosophical tomes they had to read, and some of them they were expected to almost have memorized. Okay, and they felt that reading that literature, reading that philosophy, and a lot of it's political, those discussions of political examples, legal and moral examples, they felt that that was integral to developing yourself into a sophisticated gentleman who was capable of doing the business of state, of participating in aristocratic life, in courtly life, and so on. Gee, why is it? Why is it that people in Italy just never developed an appreciation for the philosophy of Lord Shang? Why is it that nobody in Europe is interested in the Han Dynasty critique of the advantages and disadvantages of the rule of Qin Shi Huang? Why do you think that is? Why is it that a book like the Han Feizi is not regarded in Europe as being objectively for your greater happiness, for the utility of society as a whole, for us to force you to read the same way it was in China? Do you not see how profoundly stupid, self-serving, and ridiculous this is? That this whole argument relies on the fantasy of having a philosopher king force everyone to agree with his subjective notion of what is truly pleasure and what is truly pain, of what is truly in your best interest, what is truly going to lead to your happiness and to the greatest happiness of society as a whole. The utilitarian philosophy is a secular robe draped over a fundamentally religious, authoritarian, and dogmatic corpse. Dun, 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 dun.